I think one of the interesting things that that I think probably all of America, and certainly all of Christian America, is really having to come to terms with is that probably a lot of us maybe haven't really thought super intricately about how our individual vote and how a government system maybe impacts tiny little nooks and crannies of every part of life. So a lot of people loved Ronald Reagan, and maybe really loved things about either the Bush the father or Bush the son, but a lot of that may have been personality driven because there was some sort of personal affinity, or one particular decision or a program that they liked or whatever. But I think that one of the really interesting things is I travel around the country and talk to a lot of different people in different parts, in different states with slightly different cultures, slightly different economies. Iowa's different than South Carolina, is different than Nevada, is different than Virginia. So all of these places have slightly different nuances to our particular subcultures. And a lot of people are having to realize, I really haven't fully developed my own kind of philosophy and what does the Bible actually tell me about civil governance? Because I just, I watched certain news outlets, and maybe there were a couple of commentators or a couple of preachers that I really listened to, and now that this is a lot grayer, like we just talked about, I'm having to really decide for myself, how does this whole patchwork of federal government, state government, local government, where does the church fall into this? These are big questions that, if you're busy and you're raising kids and you're working a job and maybe running a company or going to school or whatever, you just don't have time to think about this stuff. But here we are with 35 days to go, and again, a lot of questions. So I think that it's healthy also, I think, in my opinion, to really acknowledge, for the Christian church in America to acknowledge, we really need, even the election is on November the 8th. I'm calling for on November the 9th for churches to continue to educate the people of God going forward on a fundamental, regular basis, so that we can really craft how does this stuff work together in America, and how do we fuse faith into every remnant of our
I know
society.
you got something to say on that, but I was going to say Martin Luther King Jr. put it most succinctly, and I love it. As I've studied history, I think his quote is so good. He said, "The church must be reminded that it is neither the master nor the servant of the state, rather it's the conscience of the state." In other words, it transcends, like Billy Graham, transcends the political context, because we understand in the scripture, in Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything that's in it. Everything. That's civil government, that's the way you handle your finances, that's private property rights, that's marriage, that's sexuality, that's everything, the way you raise your children, all things. And then in Hebrews chapter 1 he says, he sustains all things by the word of his power. Hebrews chapter 2 says, and he put all things under his feet. And then later Paul is teaching the early church, and he says, by him and for him all things were created, and in him all things have their being. So that word all things and everything means all things and everything. Romans chapter 13. The government is a minister of God for the punishment of evil and the praise of those who do right. Now, let's just pause there for a second. If the government is a minister of God, and the church is filled with God's ministers, and the word minister is servant. The church is filled with God's servant. Should the church isolate itself off in culture and stand away from government? Absolutely not. And that's why MLK's quote brings it full circle and says, no, we are the conscience. In other words, if you personally, or maybe with your marriage, or even your home, you see things that become immoral, or maybe there's some direction your children are going toward drugs, or you say, no, not in this home. You're going to head down the straight and narrow. In other words, you are now the conscience of the home. It's the same way with our government and the church. Is we say, you say that unborn children are not human beings? God creates them. God defines life, and he gives life, liberty, and justice to all people. And so we correct it. And in Martin Luther King Jr.'s day, it was that our black brothers and sisters were equally as valued. They had equal rights with us. And so he, as the conscience with many, hundreds of thousands, even millions of Christians, were able to fight for civil rights and earn it in this country. But it was the church that rose up and got involved.
Speak truth. That's right.
That's right.
You look at North and South Korea. You know, there was a time where they were just one nation, right? And then they split. I think it was just after World War II. When they split, and you got on the north side, you've got a communist dictatorship. And on the south side, you've got democracy. And on the south side, there's freedom. We go in and out of South Korea, anybody can, right? And there's free trade with South Korea. What I see happening in America is that by and large, the church wants to get out of government because they just want to focus on, you know, the salvation of the personal individual soul, but not the influencing of the nation, which flies in the face of the Matthew 28 mandate to make disciples of the nation, which is make disciple of the individual that influences the nation. And I think one of the reasons why is because we're on the South Korea side, is we have freedom, and therefore we often take it for granted. But what do you think about those North Koreans who are just on the other side of the wall, who are looking at their friends who are the South Koreans going, man, I wish I lived there. I wish that I had that type of freedom to express myself like these people do, right? If we don't, as a church, get involved in government, in voting, get involved in influencing the elections of our local officials, you know,
And running for office.
all of these things, if we don't get involved, we will end up on the North Korea side at some point. And at that point, it's too late. You know, to overthrow a dictatorship is a whole different ball game. But while we have this freedom, the church has to be involved. Agree?
Well, yeah, I think you guys are right. I mean, again, policy in the end is legislative morality. The question is what morality is going to be legislated. So if Christians are disengaged in the conscience to the government, civil obedience to the government that God has put in place, but that we're actively engaged in, if we neglect to engage in these civil policies, then some form of morality is going to be legislated, hence what we're seeing in America today. So I think that, to your point, Jason, that we're seeing a restriction of that now, and so it's causing, thank the Lord, that pressure is causing people to kind of freak out and get uncomfortable and realize, you know, something ain't right, and they're getting more engaged. So that's what we encourage people, don't just vote, but also make sure that you're running. Calvin Coolidge, one of the most conservative presidents in the 1920s, our 30th president, he said, if citizens don't vote, then a form of government will rise that they didn't want. So the most important thing to ensure the safety of the American government is at the ballot box. But if citizens do not activate that responsibility and duty, then a form of government will always rise up that they disagree with. And I think that's what a lot of Christians are saying, but we got to take part in that, realize the government we're seeing take place today is not one that we agree with.
And think about that. It's not just a responsibility and a duty, it's a privilege. Think about world history. How many people would have loved to have been the government? To have said to their governing leaders, I'm not voting for you. Me and all my friends, we're voting you out of office. I mean, you lost heads for that kind of stuff. But we have this kind of freedom.
But
what
see,
a privilege.
It is a privilege, but Tim, when it comes to government, it's not about going and just voting for somebody in. Really, government is self-governance.
Yeah,
That's what the founders
absolutely.
intended from the very beginning. I love William Penn. He was the founder of the Province of Pennsylvania. He was a great businessman, entrepreneur guy. He says, if we're not going to be governed by God, we will eventually be ruled by tyrants. Self-governance is the key here. So it's limited government. If you look at the Constitution, the government has 17 enumerated powers, but it's limited in what it can and cannot do. The founders intended that. They believed in original sin, hence the checks and balances. But we got to get back to self-governance, and that takes responsibility, and that takes community, holding those elected officials accountable. And if they don't do their duty that they're intended to do, then they get voted out. But it's really not saying we got to have the right government, federally speaking, or even statewide, in order to ensure prosperity. If we neglect self-governance, the rest of those two are going to fail. And I think that's what we got to get back to as well.